The film unfolds in the world of John Wick, opening with a young girl named Eve sitting alone in a hospital. Her clothes are stained with blood as she quietly watches a music box, where a delicate ballerina spins in endless circles. The scene then shifts into the past, revealing the life she once knew before tragedy changed everything. Eve lives peacefully with her father, Javier, who spends much of his time training her in ballet. He often praises her talent, telling her she has remarkable potential. During one practice session, he casually remarks that she dances much like her older sister once did. The comment leaves Eve confused because she has no memory of ever having a sister. That evening, Eve relaxes in her bedroom, fascinated by the tiny dancer twirling inside her treasured music box. Elsewhere in the house, Javier, whose tattoo-covered body hints at a dangerous past, quietly prepares for the night ahead. Unbeknownst to them, armed attackers have already reached the property, emerging from the water and silently eliminating the guards protecting the estate. Javier quickly senses that something is wrong. The moment he spots the intruders, he reacts immediately, fighting back with impressive skill while using a smoke grenade to disrupt their advance. Before fully joining the battle, he rushes to Eve and hides her in a concealed compartment, making her promise that she will not come out under any circumstances. Although terrified, she follows his instructions. Javier confronts the invaders with exceptional determination. His experience allows him to hold off one attacker after another, but sheer numbers slowly overwhelm him. After an intense struggle, he is finally subdued and taken prisoner. Soon afterward, the man leading the assault arrives. Known as the Chancellor, he reminds Javier that their organization once accepted him as one of their own and even allowed him to marry into the family. In his view, Javier repaid that trust with betrayal, and he also holds him responsible for his wife's death. As the confrontation continues, it becomes clear that Eve, not Javier, is the true objective. The Chancellor presents a cruel ultimatum by handing Javier a pistol containing a single bullet. If Javier ends his own life, Eve will be spared. If he turns the weapon on the Chancellor, both father and daughter will die. Faced with an unbearable decision, Javier hesitates before raising the gun, seemingly ready to make the ultimate sacrifice. Before he can act, a frightened scream echoes through the room. Eve has been watching from her hiding place, and her cry reveals her location. The Chancellor immediately heads toward her, while Javier abandons all thoughts of surrender and launches one final, desperate assault, fighting with renewed determination against the attackers. For a brief moment, Javier seems unstoppable, cutting through everyone who stands in his way. His momentum finally ends when one remaining attacker catches him off guard, forces him to the floor, and prepares to finish him. Seeing her father in mortal danger, Eve notices a weapon lying within reach. Acting on instinct rather than thought, she grabs it and fires. The gunshot kills the attacker instantly. In the aftermath, her eyes briefly fall on a mysterious emblem tattooed on the man's hand before she rushes to Javier's side. With no time to waste, the pair flee the estate together. Their escape is far from easy. Javier is struck by multiple bullets and badly wounded, yet he refuses to stop moving while Eve remains at his side. Realizing their enemies are still close behind, he throws an explosive into the house. Moments later, the blast tears through the building, collapsing it and eliminating those still inside. The explosion ends the pursuit, but it cannot save Javier. His injuries prove fatal. Despite Eve's desperate attempts to keep him alive, he dies before help can arrive. Left completely alone, she is consumed by grief and forced to face a future without the only family she has ever known. The story returns to the hospital, where Eve, still wearing blood-stained clothes, quietly holds her treasured music box while reliving the night's events. A man named Winston approaches her. As the owner of New York's Continental Hotel, he understands far more about Javier's past than Eve realizes. He tells her that her father wanted something almost impossible in their world, a normal life for his daughter. Although he cannot erase her loss, he promises she will not have to face the future alone. Keeping his word, Winston brings Eve to the Ruska Roma, an organization disguised as a prestigious ballet school but devoted to producing elite assassins. There she meets the director, who asks if she knows how to dance. Eve confidently says that she does. The director explains that discipline and training can transform her pain into strength, and that those responsible for destroying her family should never be allowed to shape the rest of her life. Before departing, Winston gives Eve a valuable gold coin and assures her that his door will always remain open if she ever needs help. With that final gesture, he leaves her in the care of the Ruska Roma. Not long afterward, Eve begins training under an instructor named Nogi. He tells her that Javier once belonged to their organization and earned the respected title of Kikimora. According to legend, a Kikimora walks in darkness but protects the innocent whenever the need arises. It is a name associated with both fear and honor. 12 years pass, and Eve grows into a disciplined young woman. She dedicates every day to relentless practice, pushing herself beyond her limits. During one demanding ballet session, her feet begin to bleed, yet she refuses to stop dancing. Her closest friend, Tatiana, urges her to rest, but Eve ignores the advice. Becoming a Kikimora means everything to her, and she refuses to let pain slow her progress. Her education extends far beyond ballet. She spends years mastering firearms, perfecting stealth, and sharpening her close-quarters combat abilities. The process is brutal, and she often loses to larger, stronger opponents. Each defeat becomes another lesson as Nogi repeatedly reminds her that natural talent means little without unwavering determination. Persistence, he says, is what separates survivors from victims. Over time, her dedication pays off. The failures that once defined her become stepping stones toward success. As the years pass, Eve develops into the finest student within the Ruska Roma. Then everything changes when Tatiana suddenly disappears without warning. Unable to ignore her friend's absence, Eve confronts the director in search of answers. She learns that Tatiana chose to abandon the organization because she lacked the resolve needed for such a dangerous existence. Rather than discouraging Eve, the revelation strengthens her resolve. Believing she has finally earned the opportunity, she requests the title of Kikimora. The director agrees that only one challenge remains. Soon afterward, Eve enters a training room where a seasoned assassin with a decade of real-world experience is waiting to test whether she is truly ready. The final evaluation follows a simple but deadly format. Two competitors are each given identical gun parts and a single cartridge. Their objective is to assemble the firearm, chamber the round, and eliminate the other before suffering the same fate. The exercise begins instantly. Both women work with incredible speed, snapping each component into place as the clock effectively measures fractions of a second. Although Eve's opponent is a seasoned assassin with years of field experience, Eve proves even faster. She completes her pistol first, loads the lone bullet, takes aim, and fires before the other woman can react. The shot lands cleanly, ending the trial almost as soon as it begins. That evening, an unexpected guest visits the Ruska Roma. The legendary John Wick arrives to speak privately with the director. After their meeting concludes, Eve approaches him out of curiosity. She asks whether he is truly the feared Baba Yaga whose reputation has spread throughout the underworld. John confirms it without boasting. Eve then asks how she can become someone of his caliber. Instead of offering guidance, John quietly studies her. Having endured years of violence himself, he understands the cost of such a life. Rather than encouraging her ambition, he advises her to leave while she still has the opportunity. In his view, she has not yet reached the point of no return. Some time later, Eve receives her first official contract. A wealthy businessman fears his daughter will become the target of a kidnapping scheme, and Eve is assigned to keep her safe. Armed with a pistol loaded with non-lethal rounds, she heads to a crowded nightclub where the young woman is spending the evening. The club is packed with music, flashing lights, and dancing crowds. From a distance, Eve keeps a careful watch over her assignment. Everything appears peaceful until several men in matching dark suits begin closing in on the woman. Their coordinated movements immediately raise her suspicions. Recognizing the threat, Eve intercepts them before they can make contact. A violent fight erupts as multiple attackers surround her at once. Although heavily outnumbered, she relies on years of disciplined training, striking vulnerable points and using efficient techniques to overcome each opponent. During the struggle, she notices the group's leader dragging the young woman toward an exit. Refusing to let him escape, Eve gives chase. Spotting an ice axe nearby, she seizes it and uses it to devastating effect. The confrontation is swift and merciless, ending only when the kidnapper is fatally defeated. With the attackers neutralized and the intended victim safe, Eve completes her assignment successfully. Her accomplishment earns her the long-awaited title of Kikimora. During the ceremony, she receives the same tattoo once worn by her father, symbolizing both her place within the Ruska Roma and the irreversible commitment she has made. From that day forward, there is no returning to an ordinary existence. 2 months later, Eve finishes another dangerous assignment. Inside a bathroom, she calmly cleans fresh cuts and bruises, showing little concern for the injuries covering her body. After checking her phone, she sees that payment for the completed contract has already been transferred to her account. As she drives away, her routine is shattered when another vehicle suddenly attacks. A fierce firefight follows, forcing Eve into another battle for survival. After an intense exchange, she finally kills her assailant. Searching the body, she discovers something deeply unsettling. The dead man's hand bears the same mysterious emblem she witnessed years ago during the attack that claimed her father's life. Determined to uncover the truth behind the symbol, Eve later brings the severed hand to the director. She explains that the identical mark belonged to one of the men involved in Javier's murder and insists that the organization connected to it has resurfaced. Eve refuses to leave without answers. When she shows the director the strange symbol, the woman immediately recognizes it and understands the danger connected to it. She warns Eve that the people behind the mark are unlike any enemy she has faced before. They operate outside normal rules, belong to an ancient organization older than the Ruska Roma, and possess a level of power that makes them extremely difficult to challenge. The warning only strengthens Eve's resolve. Determined to discover who was responsible for her father's death, she heads to New York and seeks out Winston at the Continental Hotel. After their reunion, she brings up the symbol and asks about the group connected to it. Winston initially tries to avoid revealing too much, but Eve reminds him of the promise he made when she was a child and shows him the coin he gave her. Seeing that she has returned for the truth, Winston finally agrees to help. He explains that the marked individuals are part of a hidden organization with worldwide reach and no allegiance to any government or nation. Their true base of operations is unknown, and very few people have reliable knowledge of their activities. However, Winston does know of one possible connection, a man named Daniel Pine, who has links to the group and is currently staying at the Continental in Prague. After making inquiries, Winston discovers that Daniel has a large bounty placed on him and is occupying a room at the hotel. Eve thanks Winston for the information and immediately travels to Prague. At the Prague Continental, Eve takes a room next to Daniel's and begins observing the situation. The hotel is filled with dangerous individuals drawn by the reward on Daniel's head. Among them is Lena, a determined hunter coordinating the operation. She works with a sniper positioned nearby, giving him a clear view of Daniel's location. When the sniper spots Eve entering Daniel's room, he reports the unexpected development. Inside, Eve finally meets Daniel face to face. But she quickly realizes she is not alone. Daniel is with his young daughter, Ella. The child looks at Eve without fear and asks a simple but shocking question, whether she has come there to kill her father. Eve's unexpected arrival creates a tense standoff. Daniel immediately assumes she has come for the reward placed on his head and prepares to defend himself, but Eve quickly makes her intentions clear. She explains that she is not there to collect money or harm him and Ella. Her only goal is to uncover the truth about the people connected to her father's murder. Watching from a distance, the sniper realizes the meeting has not turned violent and informs Lena that the situation is different from what they expected. In response, Lena increases the reward on Daniel, making the target even more attractive to the many killers waiting for an opportunity. Soon, the hotel becomes flooded with armed assassins determined to claim the money. Daniel blames Eve for bringing attention to his location, but he eventually reveals the real reason the organization is hunting him. Their interest is not simply about the bounty, they want Ella. Years earlier, Daniel escaped with his daughter in an attempt to protect her from being controlled by the group, making himself a permanent enemy. Before Eve can learn more, attackers arrive and force both of them into combat. Working together, the two fighters battle through the assault, combining their experience and skill to survive the overwhelming attack. During the chaos, Daniel explains that leaving this organization is nearly impossible. Once someone is connected to them, freedom usually comes at the cost of their life. Knowing he may not survive, Daniel makes Eve an offer: protect Ella, and he will share what he knows about the people tied to her father's death. Eve agrees immediately. The escape attempt begins, but their enemies quickly locate them. Lena and her team close in, revealing that they are part of the same dangerous group Daniel warned about. A violent confrontation follows. Daniel appears to be killed during the struggle, while Eve is eventually defeated by Lena and loses consciousness. With Eve unable to fight back, the attackers take Ella and complete their objective. Lena later reports the success of the operation to the Chancellor, mentioning that an unknown woman nearly interfered with their plans and created unexpected problems. When Eve awakens, she refuses to give up. Still determined to find the truth, she visits Frank, a weapons dealer who may have information about the organization. While gathering equipment, she questions him about the group's location. Frank clearly knows more than he admits but is too afraid to reveal anything. Their conversation is interrupted when armed operatives attack the shop. Eve is immediately forced into another battle. Using the weapons around her and relying on her training, she fights back with ruthless efficiency. Explosions shake the building as she eliminates the attackers one by one. Seeing that Eve's determination cannot be broken, Frank finally decides to help. He tells her about rumors of a hidden base located somewhere in the mountains. However, he warns her that everyone who has attempted to find it has disappeared. Eve accepts the information and begins the journey. Before she can get far, her phone rings. The director contacts her, angry that she has continued the pursuit alone. She warns that Eve's actions could endanger not only herself but also the entire Ruska Roma. But Eve has already chosen her path. She refuses to abandon the search for justice and ignores the warning, continuing toward the enemy's hidden territory. Eve eventually reaches the beautiful village of Hallstatt, a place that appears peaceful and untouched by the violence surrounding her. While visiting a small cafe, she notices a familiar object that immediately brings back memories from her childhood, a ballerina music box resembling the one she once cherished. Although she tries to enjoy a quiet moment, Eve quickly senses that something is unusual. The cafe feels strangely silent, and the customers seem nervous. One by one, they leave until the building is nearly empty. Then the illusion of safety disappears. A sudden attack begins inside the cafe. An armed assailant ambushes Eve, turning the peaceful location into a battlefield. Shots are exchanged as she fights to survive, while the waitress secretly contacts others for help. Eve manages to defeat her attacker, but she knows more danger is approaching. Searching for a better position, she moves through the building and encounters the waitress again. The woman is armed and ready to fight. Eve attempts to avoid unnecessary violence, but the confrontation becomes unavoidable. Using her superior training, Eve quickly disarms her and locks her away. However, escaping the immediate threat does not solve the larger problem. More people begin arriving from throughout the village, revealing that the entire community is connected to the mysterious organization pursuing her. The Chancellor announces his presence, and the peaceful town transforms into a battlefield as ordinary-looking residents reveal their weapons and join the hunt. Eve fights desperately against the overwhelming force surrounding her. She defeats numerous attackers, but the endless waves of enemies gradually wear her down. Eventually, exhaustion takes over, and she is captured. Lena arrives to inspect the prisoner and notices Eve's Ruska Roma tattoo. The discovery confirms her suspicions. Without hesitation, Lena knocks Eve unconscious. Meanwhile, Ella is taken to meet the Chancellor. The older man reveals a shocking connection: he is her grandfather. He attempts to explain his actions, claiming that Daniel stole Ella away from the family and rejected the traditions she was meant to inherit. Ella refuses to accept his justification and angrily rejects him. When Eve wakes, she finds herself face to face with the Chancellor. He explains that a fragile agreement has existed for years between his organization and the Ruska Roma. In his view, Eve's pursuit of revenge has threatened that balance. Eve argues that she acted alone, but the Chancellor believes the consequences are the same regardless of her intentions. He then admits that he was the person who placed the bounty on Daniel. To him, Daniel's decision to escape with Ella represented an unforgivable betrayal. The revelation enrages Eve. She accuses the Chancellor of being responsible for destroying her family. At first, he seems confused by her anger, but then he realizes who she is: Javier's daughter. The discovery changes the situation. The Chancellor privately speaks with Lena and reveals another hidden truth: Eve and Lena are sisters. Before anyone can fully react, Eve creates an opening and launches an escape attempt. She attacks the surrounding guards, forcing the cult members into chaos. When one fighter tries to shoot her, Lena unexpectedly intervenes, giving Eve the chance to survive. The two women soon face each other in a fierce confrontation. Eve gains control of the fight and prepares to finish it, but Lena chooses instead to reveal the truth. They share the same father. Lena explains that Javier's disappearance damaged the family and that their mother suffered because of his choices. Eve rejects this explanation, believing Javier was not a betrayer but a father who sacrificed everything to protect his child. When the Chancellor learns that the sisters are no longer fighting, he refuses to allow their bond to interfere. He orders them eliminated immediately. His followers attack with explosives, leaving both women severely injured. Amid the destruction, Eve struggles toward Lena. As they lie wounded together, Lena prepares to reveal one final secret that could change everything. Lena's final confession changes everything for Eve. She reveals that she grew up believing her younger sister had died when they were children. For years, she carried that loss without knowing the truth, that Eve had survived. The realization that her family had been separated by a lie becomes one of the most painful moments of her life. Before her injuries take her, Lena shares how much she missed the sister she thought she had lost. She spent years remembering someone who was still alive, and now, just after finding Eve again, she loses her once more. Consumed by grief and anger, Eve refuses to surrender. When the cult's fighters move in to finish her, they discover that her pain has only made her more determined. She fights with overwhelming force, cutting through every opponent who stands between her and the Chancellor. After the battle, Eve uses a fallen enemy's communication device to send a direct warning to the Chancellor: she is coming for him. The threat forces the Chancellor to confront the growing crisis. He contacts the Ruska Roma and accuses them of violating their agreement, but the director insists Eve acted independently. The Chancellor refuses to accept the explanation and threatens retaliation against the entire organization. To prevent a larger war, the director offers a solution: Eve must be stopped. The person chosen for the task is the one assassin capable of matching her, John Wick. When John finds Eve, he does not immediately attack. Instead, he gives her a chance to walk away. He understands the path she has chosen because he has lived it himself. But Eve's need for justice is stronger than fear, and she refuses to abandon her mission. Seeing her determination, John gives her a limited amount of time to finish what she started. After that, he will no longer protect her. The Chancellor responds by turning the entire village against Eve. The peaceful settlement becomes a battlefield as residents and assassins hunt her through the streets. Eve fights her way toward the Chancellor using every skill she has developed over years of brutal training. The confrontation grows increasingly destructive as she battles through waves of enemies and turns the cult's own weapons against them. Among her opponents is Dex, one of the Chancellor's most dangerous fighters. Their battle pushes Eve to her limits, with both sides using devastating weapons and refusing to surrender. Just as Dex appears ready to defeat her, John arrives and ends the fight, eliminating the threat and reminding everyone why his reputation is legendary. While John holds back the remaining attackers, Eve reaches the Chancellor, who attempts to escape with Ella. She stops him before he can flee. Facing his final moments, the Chancellor tries to convince Eve that killing him will change nothing because the organization will continue without him. But after losing her father, her sister, and everything she cared about, Eve has already made her choice. She raises her weapon, ready to decide the Chancellor's fate. The final confrontation ends with Eve delivering the justice she has been chasing for years. The Chancellor is killed, bringing an end to the man who caused so much destruction in her life. After the battle, Eve finds Ella alive and helps her escape the ruined village. John later informs the director that the Chancellor is gone, but the victory does not come without consequences. A surprising discovery follows: Daniel survived the earlier attack. Though seriously wounded, he recovers in a hospital and is finally reunited with Ella, giving them a rare moment of peace after everything they have suffered. Eve then visits the Continental, where Winston explains that removing the leader of a powerful organization does not erase the threat itself. The system behind the Chancellor still exists, and many enemies remain. The conflict may have changed, but it is far from finished. She also learns that the Ruska Roma has cut ties with her. After acting outside their authority and creating a major conflict, Eve is no longer part of the group that trained her. She must now move forward without the protection or identity she once had. Later, Eve attends a ballet performance and quietly watches Tatiana on stage. For a brief moment, she allows herself to reflect on everything she has lost and everything she has become. That peace disappears almost immediately. A new contract appears within the assassin network. A large bounty is placed on Eve, turning her into the next target for countless killers around the world. She receives the warning herself, confirming Winston's prediction that her war is not over. Without hesitation, Eve leaves the theater and disappears into the night, preparing for the battles that await her. The film ends by leaving her future uncertain, suggesting that while one chapter of her story has ended, a much larger conflict may only be beginning. The movie's connection to the John Wick universe is also a major part of its identity. Rather than restarting the franchise or creating a separate timeline, it positions itself as another story within the existing world, set during the period between earlier events in the series. That choice creates both opportunities and challenges. A John Wick spin-off carries expectations that go beyond a normal action film. Viewers are not only judging the story, characters, and fight scenes, they are comparing everything against a franchise known for its unique style, mythology, and reputation. One of the interesting choices is that the movie does not spend much time explaining the rules of this world. It assumes familiarity with elements like the Continental, the Assassin Network, and the organizations operating behind the scenes. For longtime fans, that makes the film feel naturally connected to the larger universe. For newcomers, however, some details may feel as though they belong to a story that began before they arrived. The bigger question behind the movie is whether this universe can continue successfully without John Wick as the central figure. The franchise has built an enormous identity around him, so creating a new lead character means proving that the world itself is compelling, not just the man who originally carried it. That is the challenge Ballerina takes on. It is not trying to replace John Wick. Instead, it explores whether there are other stories, other fighters, and other struggles that can exist within the same dangerous world. Whether it succeeds depends largely on how willing audiences are to embrace a new perspective while still carrying their expectations from the original series. The John Wick series has grown into something larger than a single character. Over time, its symbols and concepts, the Continental, the hidden assassin society, the currency of gold coins, and the powerful organizations controlling the underworld, have become recognizable parts of modern action cinema. But there is an important distinction between being attached to a fictional universe and being attached to the person who made that universe famous. Many fans do not simply admire the world of John Wick, they are connected to John himself. His personality, his quiet intensity, and the way Keanu Reeves portrays him became the heart of the franchise. That creates a major challenge for any spin-off. A new story cannot rely only on familiar locations and mythology. It has to convince audiences that another character can carry the emotional and cinematic weight that John Wick carried for years. This is the challenge facing Eve's story. The question is not whether the world is interesting, it clearly is. The question is whether viewers are willing to explore that world through a different perspective. Some fans welcome the opportunity to see new corners of the assassin universe, different characters, and unexplored conflicts. Others naturally compare every new entry to the original films and wonder whether another protagonist can create the same impact. That tension shapes the entire experience. The movie wants to establish Eve as her own character while also reminding audiences that she exists within a world they already know and love. At its foundation, Eve's journey is a classic revenge story. Her motivation comes from a traumatic event that changes the direction of her entire life. After losing her father as a child, she grows up surrounded by violence and discipline, eventually becoming part of the same dangerous world that took everything from her. Her training transforms her into a skilled fighter, but it does not erase the pain that drives her. Unlike someone simply completing a mission, Eve is chasing answers and trying to confront the unresolved trauma that has followed her for years. The story does not depend on a complicated mystery. From the beginning, the audience understands what Eve wants and why she is willing to risk everything to achieve it. The tension comes from watching the consequences of that pursuit and seeing how far she is willing to go. Like many revenge narratives, the central idea is simple: a person suffers a devastating loss and sets out to confront those responsible. What makes Eve's journey different is that her mission is also about identity. She is not only hunting enemies, she is trying to understand the life that was taken from her and decide who she wants to become afterward. Eve's entire journey is driven by one goal: finding the people connected to her father's murder and making them answer for what they did. Every discovery she makes and every boundary she crosses pushes her closer to that final confrontation. One of the film's interesting choices is that it does not overcomplicate her motivation. Many revenge stories rely heavily on constant surprises, betrayals, and complicated twists. This one mostly stays focused on a straightforward emotional objective. Eve knows what she wants, and the audience understands why she continues moving forward. That simplicity gives the story a clear direction. There is little confusion about her choices because every decision comes from the same source: loss, anger, and the need for closure. However, that approach also creates a challenge. When the destination is obvious, the film has to rely on the journey itself, the action, character moments, and emotional weight to keep viewers invested. Rather than attempting to reinvent revenge storytelling, the movie places a familiar structure inside the unusual setting of the John Wick universe. The basic foundation is recognizable: a devastating tragedy, years of preparation, and a protagonist finally choosing to confront the people responsible. The larger question surrounding the film is whether it expands the franchise in a meaningful way or simply uses the existing mythology as decoration. Spin-offs often face this problem. They promise to reveal unexplored parts of a fictional world, but sometimes adding too much information can make that world feel less mysterious. Here, the results are mixed. The film succeeds most when it explores areas that previously existed mostly in the background. The Ruska Roma, for example, become a much larger part of the story. Their traditions, training methods, and internal structure receive more attention, giving audiences a closer look at a group that had previously been more mysterious. Those moments are among the film's strongest because they capture something important about the franchise. The unknown is often more compelling than a complete explanation. A major strength of the earlier John Wick films has always been their ability to suggest a larger world without explaining every detail. The audience does not need every rule, history, or organization fully described for the universe to feel real. Sometimes unanswered questions create more interest than direct answers. Ballerina understands this idea in many places. It introduces new elements while still leaving room for mystery. It does not completely open every hidden door, allowing the world to maintain some of its atmosphere. However, the film occasionally struggles when it expands into deeper discussions about alliances, rival groups, and the political structure of the assassin world. Some concepts are introduced quickly, and certain relationships feel like they depend more on the audience accepting the rules than fully understanding them. That creates a delicate balance. The appeal of the John Wick universe comes from feeling both organized and mysterious at the same time. There are enough details to make the world believable, but enough uncertainty to keep it fascinating. When a story explains too much, the magic can disappear. When it explains too little, viewers may feel disconnected. The strongest moments in this universe are usually the ones where the world exists naturally around the characters instead of becoming the main focus. At its best, Ballerina understands that principle. Its biggest successes come when the mythology supports the story rather than replacing it. One of the most important things the film attempts to prove is that this universe can exist beyond its most famous character. It is not enough to bring back familiar elements or reference established mythology. A successful expansion has to make audiences believe that other stories are worth following. That is where the movie becomes interesting. It does not completely transform the John Wick mythology or redefine everything fans understand about this world. Instead, it adds new perspectives, introduces additional characters, and expands the boundaries of the setting. It suggests that the assassin world is much larger than the experiences of a single legendary figure. Whether those new stories can create the same emotional impact is another question entirely, but the attempt itself is important. A franchise cannot grow if it only repeats the same formula forever. The biggest divide among viewers is likely to come from the writing. The action is generally what people expect from this series: intense, stylish, and built around impressive physical performances. The story, however, is where opinions become much more complicated. At its foundation, the narrative is simple. Eve's mission is driven by revenge. She follows the trail of those responsible for her father's death, facing increasingly dangerous enemies along the way. The movie does not hide its destination, and that is not necessarily a problem. Many memorable action films succeed because they focus on a clear emotional objective rather than constantly adding complexity. The challenge is that the film is also trying to serve two purposes at once. It wants to tell Eve's personal story while expanding the larger mythology surrounding the assassin world. Sometimes those two elements work together, but occasionally the bigger universe begins competing with the character journey. There are moments where new organizations, alliances, and historical connections are introduced with great importance, only for some of those ideas to receive limited exploration afterward. The result is a story that remains understandable but occasionally feels like it has more threads than it has time to fully develop. The predictability of the plot is another factor. The movie is not designed as a mystery where every revelation changes the direction of the story. Most viewers will understand the general path fairly early. The effectiveness comes from watching Eve travel through that path, not from discovering where it leads. Because the story relies heavily on a familiar revenge structure, the emotional impact depends on how strongly the audience connects with Eve herself. When the character moments work, the simplicity becomes an advantage. When they do not, the predictable nature of the narrative becomes easier to notice. The dialogue follows the established style of the franchise: brief conversations, controlled emotions, and characters who speak with a sense of seriousness and purpose. For fans of the series, that atmosphere may feel natural. For others, some exchanges may feel overly restrained or intentionally dramatic. What stands out most is that the film occasionally feels like it is combining different creative approaches. Some sections feel focused and personal, while others feel designed primarily to expand the franchise mythology. Both approaches can work, but the transition between them is not always seamless. That said, the screenplay does accomplish its main goals. It gives Eve a clear motivation, places obstacles in her path, and creates a framework for the action scenes to carry emotional meaning. The writing may not always be the film's strongest feature, but it provides enough foundation for the larger experience. By the end, many viewers may remember the choreography, the atmosphere, and the world building more than specific dialogue or unexpected plot developments. For a franchise built around action and style, that may ultimately be exactly what the film is aiming for. The more interesting question is whether the movie uses its themes, loss, identity, revenge, and belonging, as genuine emotional ideas or simply as fuel to move the next fight sequence forward. That balance is what determines whether Eve's journey feels like a meaningful addition to the universe or just another chapter within it. Although revenge is the central force behind Eve's journey, the film is also interested in ideas that exist beneath that obvious motivation. Her mission begins with tragedy, and her desire for justice shapes nearly every decision she makes. The loss of her father is not just an event from her past, it becomes the foundation of the person she grows into. However, the story also explores another theme that often conflicts with revenge: the instinct to protect the people you love. Several characters attempt to warn Eve that the path she has chosen may only create more suffering. They understand the danger of a world built around violence and try to prevent her from becoming trapped by the same cycle that destroyed their own lives. That contrast gives the story some additional depth. Revenge encourages someone to move toward confrontation, while protection often requires avoiding conflict altogether. The movie repeatedly places Eve between these two opposing ideas: the need to punish those responsible for her pain and the possibility of choosing a different future. The challenge is that the film rarely stays in those emotional spaces for long. Just as it begins exploring the consequences of Eve's choices, the story quickly returns to action. Another enemy appears, another fight begins, and the momentum continues. That approach fits naturally within the John Wick style. The franchise has never focused primarily on long conversations or extended emotional analysis. Its characters often express their feelings through action rather than words. The emotions are present, but they usually exist beneath the surface. Where this film struggles slightly is in creating a deeper emotional connection between the audience and Eve. Her pain is understandable. Her reasons are clear. The movie successfully explains why she wants revenge. But explaining a character's suffering is different from making viewers feel that suffering alongside them. There are moments where the film comes close to achieving that connection. When it slows down and focuses on Eve's memories, her losses, or her search for belonging, the character becomes much more interesting. Those quieter scenes reveal that she is not simply a skilled fighter seeking revenge, she is someone trying to make sense of a life shaped by violence. The problem is that these moments often pass quickly before the story returns to action. The emotional side of Eve's journey exists, but it does not always receive enough time to fully develop. That is why reactions to the character may differ. Some viewers will connect immediately because the foundation of her story is simple and relatable. Losing family, experiencing grief, and wanting justice are powerful ideas that require little explanation. Others may understand her journey intellectually without feeling completely attached to it. Ultimately, Eve's success as a protagonist depends on whether audiences see her as more than the mission she is pursuing. The action, the franchise connections, and the world building all matter, but the real test is whether Eve herself becomes someone viewers want to follow. On the surface, she is an easy character to understand. Her childhood trauma shapes her future, her training transforms her into a weapon, and her search for those responsible gives her a clear purpose. But a clear purpose alone does not create a memorable character. The strongest protagonists are not only defined by what they want, they are defined by their personality, their conflicts, and the emotions they reveal along the way. This is where Eve's journey becomes more complicated. The film gives audiences a strong reason to follow her, but it spends less time showing who she is beyond her mission. Much of the story moves with relentless speed. Eve travels from one confrontation to another, constantly chasing the next piece of information or facing another obstacle. That creates strong momentum, but it also leaves limited space for deeper character exploration. The result is a protagonist who is compelling in concept and impressive in action, yet occasionally harder to connect with on a personal level. Her determination is obvious. Her skills are undeniable. Her motivation is powerful. The remaining question is whether the audience feels they truly know Eve, or whether they are simply watching her move toward the next battle. A major challenge with Eve as a character is that the film rarely allows viewers to see her outside the purpose driving her forward. The story clearly establishes her trauma, her goals, and the reasons behind her actions, but it spends less time exploring who she is when she is not chasing revenge. That can make emotional investment more difficult. Many memorable action protagonists are defined not only by their mission but also by the smaller details that reveal their humanity. Their personal habits, moments of uncertainty, relationships, humor, or vulnerability often create the strongest connection with the audience. Eve has glimpses of those qualities, but the movie frequently returns to her role as a fighter before those aspects can fully develop. She is determined, disciplined, and focused, but much of her identity remains tied to the objective she is pursuing. For some viewers, that will not be a problem. A revenge-driven action story does not always need extensive character exploration. If the motivation is convincing and the action is exciting, the experience can still work. For others, the emotional attachment may feel incomplete. The audience understands Eve's mission, but understanding a character's goal is different from feeling deeply connected to the person pursuing it. That difference becomes especially noticeable because the film repeatedly emphasizes the consequences of Eve's choices. Other characters warn her about the path she is taking. They question whether revenge will actually give her what she wants. The movie clearly wants viewers to think about the cost of her decisions. However, those reflections often compete with the film's momentum. Before the emotional consequences can fully settle, another conflict begins and the story moves ahead. By the end, Eve's journey is easy to summarize. Her pain, her determination, and her destination are all clear. The more difficult question is whether the audience feels they truly understand Eve beyond the revenge that defines her. The title Ballerina also creates a unique expectation. Before the film even begins, the name suggests a specific combination of ideas: elegance, discipline, movement, and violence. The concept of an assassin trained through ballet-inspired techniques has obvious potential. It creates the possibility of a fighter who moves differently from the other characters in the franchise, a person whose combat style reflects both artistic precision and deadly efficiency. That idea is what makes the character immediately interesting. The challenge is turning that concept into something that affects the entire film rather than simply serving as part of the character's background. There are moments when Eve does feel distinct. She often adapts to her surroundings, uses whatever resources are available, and approaches situations with a practical creativity that separates her from some of the more traditional assassins in this universe. Those scenes show the strongest version of the character because they suggest a fighting style and personality that belongs specifically to Eve. However, the movie sometimes falls back into familiar franchise patterns. The structure becomes recognizable: find the next target, survive an increasingly difficult confrontation, recover, and continue toward the next obstacle. Again, that is not automatically a weakness. Many viewers come to a John Wick film specifically for that rhythm. They want the atmosphere, the choreography, and the carefully designed action sequences. The question is whether the film does enough to make Eve's journey feel like its own experience rather than simply another entry using the established formula. The ballet influence is present. The Ruska Roma background is important. The visual symbolism exists. But these elements do not always shape the story as strongly as the premise suggests they might. At times, the movie seems more interested in fitting Eve into the existing John Wick framework than exploring the full potential of what makes her different. That creates an interesting divide. Some viewers will see a successful expansion of the franchise, another skilled assassin operating in the same fascinating world. Others may feel that the central idea promised something more unique. The reality is probably somewhere in the middle. The film does not ignore its concept, but it also does not completely transform it into something the franchise has never seen before. Its greatest opportunity was creating an assassin whose identity came from the contrast between performance and violence, grace and brutality. When the movie embraces that contrast, Eve becomes a much more compelling character. When it moves back into familiar territory, she risks becoming another talented fighter in a world already filled with them. The biggest question surrounding Eve is not whether she works as an action hero. The film clearly proves that she can handle herself. The more interesting question is whether the character feels unique enough to justify an entire movie built around her. That is where the challenge of a spin-off becomes obvious. A new entry in an established universe has two responsibilities. It must feel connected to the world audiences already love, but it also has to offer a reason for its own existence. Simply adding another skilled assassin is not enough. The character and the story need to bring something different. Eve comes close to achieving that. She is not presented as a copy of John Wick. She does not move through every battle with complete confidence or overwhelming superiority. Instead, the film often shows her struggling, adapting, and surviving through determination. That choice creates a different type of action protagonist. Eve is not someone who enters every fight already knowing she will win. She gets injured, makes mistakes, and is forced to find solutions while under pressure. Her victories feel earned because they come after genuine difficulty. For many viewers, that makes the action more engaging. The danger feels real because Eve is constantly tested. She is not invincible, and the physical consequences of every confrontation remain visible. However, that same approach creates debate. Some audiences may feel that a character trained by one of the most dangerous organizations in this universe should appear more dominant. When she struggles against certain opponents, it can create questions about how capable she is supposed to be. The movie is therefore walking a narrow line. Make Eve too powerful and the tension disappears. Make her too vulnerable and viewers may question whether she truly belongs among the elite assassins surrounding her. One of the strongest aspects of Eve's fighting style is that the film emphasizes creativity rather than pure strength. She does not always win because she is the strongest person in the room. She wins because she notices opportunities, uses her surroundings, and refuses to give up. That quality helps separate her from other characters in the franchise. Her greatest weapon is not simply training. It is adaptability. The film clearly understands that making Eve a direct replacement for John Wick would have been a mistake. The goal is not to create another version of the same character. Instead, it tries to introduce someone whose methods and motivations are shaped by a different experience. Where the movie becomes less consistent is in defining exactly how powerful Eve should be. Some sequences present her as a highly skilled professional capable of handling impossible situations. Other moments make her seem far less prepared than her background suggests. This creates a slightly uneven impression of her abilities. Another important part of Eve's character is control over her own journey. A strong action protagonist is not defined only by physical victories. They also need to feel like the person making the important choices. Fortunately, Eve is usually the driving force behind the story. She ignores warnings, accepts the consequences, and continues forward because of her own decisions. Her pursuit is personal, and the movie makes sure that her actions come from her own desires rather than simply following someone else's plan. The success of the character ultimately depends on how much viewers connect with her. Some will see a determined survivor who fights through impossible circumstances. Others may feel that the film stops short of fully developing the legendary figure it hints she could become. Either way, Eve is the foundation holding the entire movie together. The difficult question for the film is how to balance these appearances. A spin-off needs enough connection to satisfy existing fans, but it also needs enough independence to establish a future of its own. Ballerina does not always find that balance perfectly. At its strongest, the returning characters enrich Eve's journey and make the universe feel deeper. At other times, their presence reminds viewers how much history already exists around her. Ultimately, the movie's success depends on whether audiences leave remembering the new character or mainly appreciating the familiar world surrounding her. The film makes a strong effort to establish Eve, but the shadow of the franchise remains one of its greatest challenges. One of the strengths of Ballerina is how effectively it uses returning characters to maintain a connection with the larger franchise. Their appearances remind viewers that Eve's story is happening inside an already established world rather than in a separate corner with no connection to what came before. That continuity is valuable. The organizations, traditions, and relationships feel familiar, which helps the movie immediately establish its place within the larger mythology. At the same time, there is always a danger with bringing back recognizable characters. Familiarity can create excitement, but it can also become a substitute for developing new emotional investments. A spin-off has to use returning figures as support, not as the main reason audiences remain interested. For the most part, Ballerina finds a reasonable balance. The returning characters add history and credibility, while the newer additions help the film feel like an expansion rather than a simple continuation of the previous stories. Not every supporting character receives enough attention, but the overall cast succeeds at making the world feel larger than Eve's personal journey. It gives the impression that this assassin society existed before her arrival and will continue operating after her story ends. That sense of a living universe has always been one of the franchise's biggest strengths. The biggest question surrounding the film before release was obvious: how much of John Wick would actually appear? The interesting thing is that both possible criticisms make sense. Some viewers may feel his involvement was too limited because he is the face of the franchise. Others may argue that any significant appearance risks distracting from Eve's story. The movie's decision to include him creates a complicated situation because this is supposed to be a new chapter. A spin-off only works if the new protagonist receives enough space to become important on their own. For much of the film, John Wick's presence is handled carefully. He exists as part of the same world, but the narrative remains focused on Eve. His connection to this universe adds context without completely taking over. The real issue is not how many minutes he appears. It is why he appears. A returning character can strengthen a story when their involvement feels necessary. It can remind audiences of the larger timeline, reinforce connections, and make the world feel consistent. However, if that character appears mainly because audiences expect them, the result can feel different. Instead of expanding the story, the appearance may feel like a reminder of what the franchise was built around. That is the challenge with John Wick specifically. Keanu Reeves created a character with such a strong identity that his presence naturally changes the atmosphere of any scene. Even when the story belongs to someone else, audiences immediately notice him. This creates an unavoidable shift in attention. Viewers may begin wondering what John Wick will do rather than focusing entirely on Eve's next decision. That does not mean his inclusion is a mistake. In many ways, his involvement helps connect the film to the broader universe. It confirms that these events are happening within the same timeline and that Eve's story matters within the larger world. The question is whether the movie fully trusts Eve to stand without that connection. A successful franchise expansion eventually needs characters who can carry stories without constantly depending on the original hero. The goal is not to remove John Wick from the universe, but to prove that the universe is bigger than him. That is the real test facing Ballerina. John Wick remains an important part of the franchise's identity, but future stories will need new figures who can create their own legacy rather than existing only in his shadow. Another interesting part of Ballerina is the conversation surrounding its production. Before the film reached audiences, discussion about behind-the-scenes changes, additional filming, and creative adjustments became part of the public perception surrounding it. That can create a difficult environment for any movie. When viewers hear repeated reports about production challenges, they often begin watching with expectations that something must be wrong. Sometimes those concerns are justified. Sometimes they are not. Many major films go through significant changes during development and editing. Additional filming, rewritten scenes, and adjustments in tone are common parts of modern filmmaking. The real question is not whether changes happened. The question is whether the final version feels complete and intentional. With a franchise as established as John Wick, expectations are especially high. Audiences are not only judging the individual movie, they are also judging whether it successfully expands a world they already care about. That makes the final result even more important because the film has to overcome both the pressure of its own story and the expectations created before release. Whenever a film has a complicated production history, audiences often start viewing every weakness through that lens. A scene that feels uneven becomes evidence of studio interference. A transition that feels rushed becomes proof of rewrites. A moment that does not fully work gets connected to whatever rumors existed before release. Sometimes those assumptions are accurate. Other times, they become a distraction from evaluating the movie that actually reached theaters. In the case of Ballerina, the most important thing is that the finished film remains functional. Whatever changes happen behind the scenes, the final version still has a clear direction. The story can be followed. Eve's motivations remain understandable. The movie has a beginning, middle, and end that feel connected. It may not always be perfectly smooth, but it does not feel like a project that completely lost control during development. A large part of the discussion naturally turns toward the director's role and how that creative approach fits within the larger John Wick style. That is a difficult challenge because this franchise has developed a very recognizable identity over several films. The series has its own visual atmosphere, its own approach to pacing, and its own philosophy regarding action. A new filmmaker entering that world has to respect those elements while also finding room for a personal touch. One of the strongest aspects of Ballerina is that it understands the language of the franchise. The movie feels connected to the same world. The environments, tone, and overall presentation make it clear that this is not a separate action film simply borrowing the name. That familiarity works in the movie's favor. However, the same quality can also limit it. At times, the film appears more focused on preserving the established identity of the franchise than creating a completely new one. It successfully feels like a John Wick story, but it does not always push far enough to redefine what a John Wick story can be. Where the direction becomes most effective is during the action sequences. The film demonstrates a strong understanding of visual clarity. The fights are usually easy to follow, the locations are used effectively, and the choreography is allowed enough space to make an impression. That is especially important in modern action cinema, where fast editing and excessive camera movement can sometimes make sequences difficult to appreciate. Ballerina generally avoids that problem. The audience can understand where characters are, what they are attempting, and why each movement matters. That respect for action design is one of the biggest connections it shares with the previous films. The discussion becomes more complicated when considering the involvement of other creative voices connected to the franchise. Whenever a filmmaker strongly associated with a successful series contributes to a project, fans naturally begin wondering how much influence they had. Which scenes changed? Which ideas came from whom? How different was the movie at earlier stages? In reality, most audiences will never have a complete answer to those questions, and the final product is ultimately what matters. A film is not judged by its production history alone. It is judged by whether the experience works. With Ballerina, you can occasionally sense that different creative decisions may have shaped different sections of the movie. Some parts feel completely confident. Others feel like they are balancing multiple priorities at once. There are moments where the transitions are not as seamless as they could be, but the movie still arrives at a coherent destination. That is an accomplishment in itself. Many films affected by major changes struggle to maintain a consistent identity. Ballerina manages to avoid becoming that kind of experience. It may not feel completely effortless, but it remains recognizable, focused, and connected to the world it belongs to. One area where the film receives much less debate is its visual presentation. The John Wick franchise has always placed enormous importance on style. The atmosphere is not just decoration, it is part of the storytelling. The contrast between luxury and brutality, beauty and violence, has always been central to the series. Ballerina understands that expectation. From the beginning, the movie feels like it belongs in the same cinematic space. The lighting, production design, and locations carry the same sense of controlled elegance that audiences associate with this universe. Dark environments, dramatic colors, and carefully composed images help create a world that feels heightened without becoming completely unrealistic. That balance is difficult. The franchise exists somewhere between realism and fantasy. The characters perform impossible feats, yet the presentation remains grounded enough that viewers accept the rules of the world. The cinematography plays a major role in maintaining that feeling. Another strength is the way the camera handles action. Instead of hiding choreography behind constant cuts, the film often gives viewers enough time to appreciate the physical work happening on screen. Good action is not only about speed. It is about clarity, rhythm, and understanding the movement between characters. When Ballerina succeeds most, it remembers that the audience wants to experience the action rather than simply witness a collection of edited images. That visual confidence is one of the reasons the film feels connected to its predecessors, even when it is still searching for a stronger identity of its own. That sense of history is one of the reasons the John Wick universe has remained so engaging over the years. The world never feels like it was created only for the convenience of the current plot. Instead, it feels like there are countless events happening beyond what the audience is seeing. Characters have relationships that existed long before they appear on screen. Organizations have traditions that go back generations. Locations feel like they have witnessed hundreds of stories before Eve ever steps into them. Ballerina benefits from that foundation because it does not need to build an entire universe from the ground up. It inherits one that already feels established. The challenge, however, is making sure that familiarity does not become repetition. A world can feel connected without feeling recycled. That is the difficult balance every franchise expansion has to achieve. For the most part, Ballerina understands the importance of atmosphere. The movie knows that the appeal of this universe has never been only about assassins fighting each other. It is about the strange elegance surrounding that violence. The contrast between luxury and brutality. The idea that a beautiful location can become the setting for absolute chaos within seconds. That contrast has always been one of the defining characteristics of the franchise, and Ballerina continues that tradition effectively. A quiet room can feel threatening because you know what kind of people occupy this world. A conversation at a dinner table can carry the same tension as a gunfight because every character understands the consequences of crossing certain lines. The movie occasionally struggles with its storytelling, but it rarely struggles with creating an atmosphere where danger feels permanent. That is especially important because the John Wick universe has always relied on a very specific kind of fantasy. It is not the fantasy of superheroes or unstoppable warriors. It is the fantasy of hidden systems existing beneath ordinary life. The idea that beneath the surface of the world we know, there are rules, organizations, and conflicts that most people will never see. Ballerina expands that idea by showing another corner of that hidden world. It suggests that the assassin network is even larger and more complicated than previous films revealed. Whether every new element introduced feels equally compelling is debatable, but the larger concept remains interesting. One of the film's strongest qualities is that it understands the importance of mystery. The best parts of this universe have often been the things left unexplained. The continental, the high table, the rules surrounding the coins and markers, the traditions followed by different groups, all of these ideas work because they suggest something much larger than what is immediately shown. Ballerina occasionally comes close to over-explaining some of those ideas, but it usually pulls back before the mystery completely disappears. That restraint helps maintain the feeling that this world continues beyond the edges of the screen. And that might actually be the biggest success of the movie's technical and world-building elements. Even when the story itself is uneven, the film still convinces you that this universe has room for more stories. It creates the feeling that Eve is only one person moving through a much larger conflict. That is ultimately what a successful spin-off needs to accomplish. It does not have to replace the original story. It does not have to make audiences forget John Wick. It simply has to prove that there are still interesting corners of this world waiting to be explored. Ballerina does not completely redefine the franchise, and it does not reach the same level of impact as the strongest entries in the series. But visually and atmospherically, it understands what made audiences fall in love with this universe in the first place. The violence feels physical. The locations feel meaningful. The style remains intact. And even when the narrative slows down, the world itself continues pulling you forward. For an action franchise built on precision, discipline, and controlled chaos, that consistency matters more than it might initially appear. And that is something the John Wick franchise has always understood better than many other action series. The fights are not simply sequences placed between story moments. They are carefully designed experiences where movement, editing, sound, and music all work together to create a specific emotional reaction. Ballerina clearly understands that philosophy. The best action scenes in the film are not memorable only because of who wins or loses. They are memorable because of the way they feel. The rhythm of the scene matters. The build-up matters. The transition from silence into complete chaos matters. A great action sequence is almost like a piece of choreography, and the music becomes another performer within that choreography. That connection between movement and sound is especially appropriate for a film centered around a character whose background is tied to dance. The title suggests a relationship between performance and violence, between elegance and brutality. Even when the movie does not explore that idea as deeply as it could have, the connection still appears in the way certain scenes are structured. Eve's movements often feel less like traditional combat and more like a desperate, violent form of adaptation. She is not simply overpowering opponents. She is reacting, shifting, and surviving. The soundtrack helps sell that feeling. It gives some of the fights a sense of progression rather than making them feel like a collection of individual attacks. The best moments are the ones where the music, camera, and choreography seem to be moving with the same purpose. That said, the musical identity of Ballerina does not completely redefine the franchise either. Like many elements of the movie, it is more of an extension than a reinvention. It understands the formula and executes it effectively, but it rarely pushes the style into completely unexpected territory. Still, there is something to be said for consistency. In a franchise where audiences have developed very specific expectations, maintaining that level of craftsmanship is not a small achievement. The music helps preserve the feeling that this is still part of the same cinematic world while giving individual scenes their own emotional texture. Another area where the film benefits from its audio design is the use of silence. One of the most effective tools in an action movie is knowing when not to overwhelm the audience. The absence of music can sometimes create more tension than a dramatic score. A quiet moment before violence begins can feel more intense because viewers know what is coming. Ballerina uses those moments well. The sudden shift from calm to destruction has always been one of the franchise's strengths, and the sound design continues that tradition. A room that feels peaceful one second can become terrifying the next because every sound suddenly matters. A weapon being prepared. Footsteps approaching. A door opening. A brief pause before everything erupts. Those details create suspense in a way that goes beyond simply making explosions louder. And that connects back to one of the movie's biggest strengths overall, commitment to the experience. Even when the story does not always reach the emotional heights it appears to be aiming for, the technical elements consistently show a clear understanding of what kind of film Ballerina wants to be. The production design, cinematography, costumes, music, and sound all work together toward the same goal. They create a world that feels stylish, dangerous, and larger than any single character. They reinforce the idea that this assassin society has existed for generations and will continue long after the current conflict ends. That might actually be the most important achievement of the film. A spin-off does not succeed simply because it adds another story. It succeeds when it makes the audience believe that more stories naturally exist within that world. Ballerina does that. It may not completely escape the shadow of John Wick. It may not transform the franchise in the way some viewers hoped. But it proves that the universe has enough atmosphere, history, and visual identity to support another perspective. And in a franchise built around style, precision, and controlled chaos, preserving that feeling is already a meaningful accomplishment. And in a way, that is both the movie's greatest strength and its biggest limitation. Ballerina understands exactly what audiences expect from a John Wick spin-off, and it delivers that experience with confidence. The action is the part of the film where the identity feels the clearest. There is very little uncertainty about what kind of movie this wants to be when the fighting begins. The challenge is that action this impressive creates its own expectations. When the set pieces are operating at such a high level, every quieter section of the movie is naturally judged against them. The audience starts waiting for the next major sequence, and if the emotional or narrative material between those moments does not feel equally compelling, the contrast becomes more noticeable. That has always been a difficult balance for this franchise. The John Wick movies were never only about action. The reason those films connected so strongly was because the action existed alongside a very clear emotional engine. The fights mattered because audiences understood exactly what John had lost and exactly why he was willing to keep going. Ballerina attempts to create that same connection with Eve. Her motivation is clear. Her pain is understandable. Her determination is obvious. But the action is so consistently impressive that it sometimes becomes the element audiences are most eager to return to. The emotional journey occasionally feels like the bridge between spectacular moments rather than the force driving them. Still, the fact that the action works as well as it does deserves credit. A lot of films can create large-scale fights. Far fewer can make those fights feel carefully designed. There is a difference between simply increasing the amount of violence and creating action that feels like it has personality. Ballerina usually understands that difference. The best sequences are not memorable because they contain the most explosions or the highest number of enemies. They are memorable because they have an idea behind them. A location becomes a weapon. A limitation becomes an opportunity. A disadvantage becomes part of the strategy. The environment influences the choreography instead of simply existing around it. That approach is one of the reasons the franchise has remained so recognizable. A fight inside a nightclub feels different from a fight in a museum. A confrontation in a hallway feels different from a confrontation on a staircase. The setting changes the way characters move, and the way characters move changes the entire feeling of the scene. Ballerina continues that philosophy effectively. There is also a physicality to the action that helps separate it from many modern blockbuster sequences. The film understands the importance of weight. Characters do not simply move from one attack to another without consequence. They get tired. They struggle. They absorb damage. They have to fight through exhaustion. That physical vulnerability gives the action tension. Even when you know Eve is likely to survive, the movie often makes the journey towards survival feel difficult. She does not walk away from every confrontation untouched. Every victory appears to cost her something. That quality makes the action more engaging because the audience is not only watching whether she wins. They are watching how much she has to sacrifice to win. The other important factor is that Ballerina does not completely copy John Wick's style of combat. It borrows the language of the franchise, but Eve's fights often feel more chaotic and desperate. John Wick frequently operates like someone who has mastered the rules of this world. Eve often feels like someone trying to survive inside it. That distinction helps the character. She is not simply presented as another legendary assassin who can effortlessly eliminate anyone standing in her way. She is someone still proving herself, still adapting, still discovering how far she is willing to go. Her fighting style reflects that emotional state. Of course, this also creates another debate. Some viewers may appreciate that vulnerability because it makes Eve feel more human. Others may feel that someone trained by the Ruska Roma should appear more consistently dominant. Once again, the movie finds itself walking a narrow line. But regardless of where people land on that issue, there is no denying that the action is where Ballerina feels most confident. It is the area where the film most clearly understands its purpose and most successfully connects with the legacy it is trying to continue. By the time the credits roll, many viewers will probably remember specific action moments before they remember individual pieces of dialogue. They will remember the creativity, the escalation, the physical performances, and the sheer commitment behind the choreography. And for a movie carrying the expectations of a franchise famous for redefining modern action, that is a significant achievement. The question is not whether Ballerina can deliver great action. It absolutely can. The bigger question is whether everything surrounding the action is strong enough to make audiences care about what happens between those moments. Because impressive fights can make a movie exciting. A compelling character and story are what make people want to see the next one. They see it as a continuation of the same larger-than-life mythology that made the franchise popular in the first place. The appeal was never supposed to be realism. It was always about style, commitment, and the feeling that these characters exist in a world where normal limitations simply do not apply. That is why the John Wick universe works when it works. It creates its own internal logic and then commits to it completely. The audience accepts impossible situations because the movie itself never hesitates. It presents everything with such confidence that eventually the question stops being, could this really happen, and becomes, does this moment feel right for this world? Ballerina understands that principle. It is not interested in grounding itself in reality. It is interested in creating a heightened fantasy where skill, determination, and sheer willpower can carry characters far beyond ordinary human limits. The challenge is that this kind of storytelling requires a very specific level of audience investment. Once viewers accept the rules, the experience can become incredibly entertaining. Once they stop accepting them, the entire illusion begins to weaken. There were definitely moments where I found myself completely accepting the absurdity because the filmmaking was so committed. The choreography, the performances, the camera work, and the sheer energy of the scenes were enough to carry me through situations that would probably fall apart under closer examination. But there were also moments where the movie stretches that suspension of disbelief so far that you become aware of the mechanics behind it. You stop thinking about Eve as a character fighting for survival and start thinking about the fact that she has survived an unbelievable amount of damage. That is always the danger with action movies built around endurance. The more punishment a hero absorbs, the harder it becomes to maintain tension. If the audience begins believing that the protagonist can survive anything, then individual moments of danger lose some of their impact. Ballerina occasionally struggles with that balance. The best action movies make you believe the hero might actually fail, even if you know the hero probably won't. They create uncertainty through timing, strategy, and circumstance. The audience is not only asking whether the character will survive. They are asking how they will survive. Ballerina achieves that in some sequences better than others. When Eve is forced to improvise, when she is outnumbered, when she has to use the environment creatively, the tension feels much stronger. Those moments highlight her intelligence and adaptability. The moments that work less effectively are the ones where survival starts feeling less like a result of skill and more like pure endurance. When the answer becomes, she can continue because she refuses to stop, the emotional stakes become slightly less immediate. Again, this is not unique to Ballerina. It is a challenge that comes with the entire genre. The difference between a thrilling action hero and an unrealistic one is often not the number of impossible things they survive. It is whether the audience believes the character has earned those moments. For the most part, Eve earns them because the movie consistently shows her determination. She is not simply powerful. She is persistent. She gets hurt, she struggles, she adapts, and she keeps going. That persistence becomes one of the defining qualities of the character. It also connects back to one of the film's bigger themes. Eve is not fighting because she believes she is invincible. She is fighting because she has reached a point where the alternative, giving up, accepting the loss, walking away, feels impossible. That emotional foundation helps justify some of the movie's more exaggerated moments. The physical reality may be stretched, but the emotional reality remains understandable. Ultimately, Ballerina asks viewers to meet it halfway. It asks you to accept a world where assassins operate under ancient rules, where impossible fights happen regularly, and where survival often depends on something beyond ordinary human ability. If you are willing to accept those rules, the film delivers exactly the kind of heightened action experience it promises. If you are looking for realism, restraint, or consequences that follow normal human limitations, this probably is not the movie that will change your mind. And that is probably the most consistent thing about Ballerina. It knows exactly what kind of universe it belongs to. It is not trying to escape the larger-than-life mythology of John Wick. It is embracing it. What's interesting is that both reactions make sense because Ballerina is built around a very specific kind of momentum. It is not a movie that wants the audience to sit with uncertainty for long periods of time. It is constantly moving toward the next objective, the next confrontation, the next escalation. That creates a certain confidence. The film knows exactly what type of experience it wants to provide. At the same time, that constant movement can occasionally work against it. The best action movies understand that pacing is not only about speed. It is about contrast. A quiet moment feels more meaningful when it exists between moments of chaos. A fight feels more intense when the audience has had time to understand what is at stake. A character decision feels more important when the movie allows the consequences to actually settle. Ballerina occasionally struggles with that balance because it is so eager to maintain forward momentum that it sometimes sacrifices opportunities for reflection. There are scenes where the movie could have benefited from simply staying with Eve a little longer. Not necessarily adding more dialogue or slowing the story down dramatically, but allowing certain moments to carry more emotional weight. A look, a reaction, a moment of hesitation, or even a brief pause could have revealed more about who Eve is beyond her mission. Instead, the film often moves immediately toward the next piece of the puzzle. That approach works extremely well when the action is at its strongest. When the choreography is creative and the tension is high, the relentless pace becomes an advantage. The movie feels urgent. It feels alive. You understand why Eve cannot stop moving because stopping could mean failure or death. In those moments, the pacing reflects the character's own state of mind. The problem appears when the movie reaches scenes that require a different kind of energy. Emotional moments need space. Character development needs time. World building needs room to breathe. When everything is treated with the same level of urgency, certain elements naturally become less impactful. A major revelation, a personal conflict, or an important relationship can sometimes feel like another checkpoint on the way to the next action sequence. That is probably why the film creates such different reactions among viewers. Some people will experience the pace as exciting and efficient. They will appreciate that the story wastes very little time and constantly delivers something new. Others will feel that the movie moves so quickly that it rarely allows its strongest ideas to fully develop. The interesting thing is that neither perspective is necessarily wrong. Ballerina is clearly designed as a propulsion machine. It wants to take the audience through a violent, stylish, high-energy journey rather than a slow character examination. The question is whether that choice perfectly matches the story it is trying to tell. Because beneath all the action, this is still a movie about grief, identity, revenge, and the consequences of living inside a world built around violence. Those are themes that naturally invite patience. They require moments where characters are allowed to exist outside the action. And whenever Ballerina gives itself that opportunity, the film becomes much more interesting. The pacing, then, becomes a perfect example of the movie's overall strengths and weaknesses. It is undeniably entertaining. It rarely becomes boring. It constantly gives audiences reasons to stay engaged. But sometimes it feels as though the movie is running so quickly toward its destination that it forgets to fully appreciate the journey. And perhaps that is the biggest pattern throughout Ballerina. The film understands what made the John Wick universe popular. It understands the style, the action, the atmosphere, and the mythology. What it is still figuring out is how to make audiences care about a new character with the same intensity they cared about the original one. Because ultimately, the future of this franchise will not be decided by whether it can create more assassins, more organizations, or more elaborate rules. The world is already there. The question is whether audiences will continue showing up for the people who inhabit it. Eve represents the beginning of that experiment. She is capable. She is determined. She has a distinct personality and a different approach to survival. Ana de Armas gives the role the commitment it requires. But the movie leaves open the larger question of whether this universe can create another figure who feels essential rather than simply connected. And that may be the most interesting thing about Ballerina. It is not just a spin-off. It is a test of whether the John Wick universe can become something larger than John Wick himself. Whether it completely succeeds is still up for debate. But the attempt is what makes the film worth discussing. There is a difference between maintaining a consistent tone and maintaining the exact same emotional temperature throughout the entire film. Ballerina is very good at the first one. It knows what kind of atmosphere it wants to create. The problem is that it does not always provide enough variation within that atmosphere. When every character speaks with complete seriousness, every location feels heavy with importance, and every conflict is treated like a matter of life and death, the effect can sometimes become less powerful simply because there are fewer moments of contrast. That is something the best entries in this franchise have always understood. Even though the world of John Wick is incredibly serious, it has never been afraid of style, elegance, or moments of strange beauty. There is an almost surreal quality to the universe. Assassins attend formal meetings. Rules are enforced through ancient traditions. Violence happens in environments that feel almost theatrical. That contrast between the absurd and the serious is a major part of what makes the franchise work. Ballerina captures much of that atmosphere, but it occasionally leans so heavily into seriousness that some of the more unusual elements of the world lose their sense of wonder. Instead of feeling mysterious and fascinating, certain parts of the mythology can begin feeling like information that the audience is simply expected to accept. The interesting thing is that the movie's commitment is also one of its greatest strengths. It would have been very easy for a spin-off like this to become too self-aware. It could have made jokes about the ridiculousness of the world. It could have constantly reminded audiences that it knew how over-the-top everything was. But that would have changed the entire identity of the franchise. The reason these films work is because they believe in themselves. They create a world where impossible things happen, then present those impossible things with complete confidence. That confidence is contagious. If the characters believe this world exists, the audience is much more likely to believe it too. Eve benefits from that approach because her journey never feels like a parody of the assassin lifestyle. Her pain is treated seriously. Her mission matters to her. The people around her respond to the consequences of violence as though those consequences are real. Even when the situations become extreme, the emotional stakes remain grounded in personal loss. However, the same seriousness that gives the movie weight can also limit some of its personality. A character like John Wick became iconic not only because of his skills, but because of the strange combination of qualities surrounding him. He was intimidating, quiet, almost mythical, yet there was always something fascinating about the way he moved through this bizarre world. The mystery surrounding him became part of the appeal. With Eve, the film gives us a clearer emotional journey, but sometimes less mystery. We understand her pain. We understand her goal. We understand why she keeps fighting. What is less developed is the feeling that there is something about her we are still discovering. That may be one of the biggest challenges moving forward. John Wick worked partly because he felt larger than the story itself. He seemed like someone with an entire history we would never fully know. Eve, at least in this first film, feels more like someone whose history the audience is gradually being introduced to. Neither approach is necessarily better. They simply create different relationships between the character and the audience. One creates fascination through mystery. The other creates connection through understanding. Ballerina clearly chooses the second path. And that choice fits the movie's overall identity. This is not a story about a legend returning from retirement. It is a story about someone becoming a legend through pain, training, and survival. The question is whether the franchise gives Eve enough room to evolve beyond the revenge that created her. Because revenge is a powerful starting point for a character. It creates immediate motivation. It creates conflict. It creates momentum. But eventually, every revenge story reaches the same question: what happens after revenge is achieved? That is where the future of Eve's character becomes genuinely interesting. If the franchise continues exploring her, the most compelling stories may not be about who she has to kill next. They may be about who she becomes once the thing that defined her is no longer there. And that is perhaps the biggest opportunity hidden inside Ballerina. Beneath the action, the weapons, and the elaborate mythology, there is a character who has spent her entire life preparing for one moment. The next step is discovering whether she can exist beyond that moment. For now, though, Ballerina remains exactly what it sets out to be: a serious, stylish, extremely violent action film that understands the world it has entered. It may not completely redefine the franchise, and it may not escape every shadow cast by John Wick himself, but it proves that there are still stories to tell inside this universe. The larger question is whether those stories can eventually become memorable because of the characters who lead them, rather than simply because they happen in the same world. And that is the challenge every future John Wick spin-off will have to answer. That comparison becomes even more complicated because John Wick was never just about the action. Yes, the action was the obvious attraction. The choreography, the creativity, the practical stunts, the visual style, all of those things became defining features of the franchise. But underneath all of that was a very specific emotional foundation. The first film worked because the audience immediately understood what John lost. His mission was simple, but the emotional weight behind that mission gave every confrontation meaning. Ballerina is attempting to create a similar structure. Eve has her own tragedy. She has her own reason to fight. She has her own pain driving every decision she makes. The difference is that audiences have already experienced a version of this journey before, and the impact of seeing a character pushed beyond their limits is naturally different when the audience is comparing it to someone who became an icon. John Wick became memorable because the world reacted to him before we fully understood him. People whispered about him. They feared him. They treated his return as something almost impossible. The legend existed before the man stepped back into the spotlight. Eve does not have that advantage. Her story is about building that reputation rather than inheriting it. In theory, that should create an interesting character arc. Watching someone become the thing everyone else fears can be just as compelling as watching a legend return. The challenge is that Ballerina has to complete that transformation within a single film while also delivering everything audiences expect from a franchise entry. That creates a difficult balancing act. The movie has to introduce Eve, establish her emotional journey, expand the mythology, deliver major action sequences, and remind audiences why they love this world. Sometimes those goals work together beautifully. Other times, one element takes priority over another. The original John Wick films had the benefit of gradually building their mythology over time. Each movie added another layer. The rules became clearer without completely removing the mystery. The world expanded naturally because audiences were already invested in the central character. Ballerina has to do the opposite. It enters an already established universe and tries to create a new emotional center inside it. That is a much harder task because the audience already knows the language of this world. They already know what the high table represents. They already understand the Continental. They already know the reputation attached to someone like John Wick. The question is not whether Ballerina belongs in this universe. It clearly does. The question is whether it creates something that feels equally essential. And that distinction explains why reactions to the film are so divided. Some viewers approach it as another chapter in a world they already love. For them, seeing new characters, new locations, and new conflicts is enough. They enjoy spending more time inside this universe. Other viewers approach it with a different expectation. They want the next great character. They want someone who creates the same feeling of anticipation that John Wick created. They want a figure who makes the franchise feel like it is moving forward rather than simply expanding outward. Those are very different standards. If you judge Ballerina purely as a spin-off action film, it succeeds in many important ways. It delivers the style, the violence, the atmosphere, and the craftsmanship people associate with the franchise. It understands the world it belongs to. If you judge it as the beginning of a new era for the franchise, the results become more complicated. The potential is clearly there. Eve works as a protagonist. Ana de Armas brings enough intensity and physical commitment to make the character believable. But the movie does not completely erase the feeling that she is entering a world that already has its defining figure. And maybe that is unavoidable. Some characters become so strongly connected to a franchise that every new edition has to fight against their shadow. The challenge is not replacing John Wick. It is creating someone audiences care about even when John Wick is not part of the conversation. That may be the most important thing Ballerina accomplishes. It does not prove that the franchise has found its next legendary figure. But it does prove that there are other stories worth telling within this world. The next step will be determining whether those stories can stand on their own. Because a successful universe is not built by endlessly expanding the map. It is built by creating characters audiences want to follow, even when the original hero is no longer leading the way. And that is the true test waiting for every future chapter of the John Wick franchise. They might notice the predictable structure, the moments where the character development feels limited, or the places where the screenplay doesn't reach the same level as the action. Someone watching it in a packed theater, however, might be more willing to overlook those weaknesses because the overall experience is doing exactly what the movie was designed to do. That is the interesting thing about action films. Sometimes the environment becomes part of the movie itself. A great action sequence is not only about what is happening on screen. It is about how the audience experiences it. The scale, the sound, the energy of the room, the collective reaction from other viewers. All of those things can influence how memorable a moment feels. Ballerina is particularly suited to that kind of experience because so much of its appeal comes from physicality. The movie is built around movement. It is built around impact. It is built around the feeling of watching someone push themselves beyond normal limits. Those elements naturally benefit from a larger presentation. There is also something about seeing a film like this with an audience that changes the rhythm. When a massive action sequence begins and everyone in the theater becomes completely focused, the movie gains a certain momentum that is difficult to recreate alone. The crowd reacts together. The tension builds together. The biggest moments feel bigger because everyone is experiencing them at the same time. That doesn't mean theatrical viewing fixes everything. It doesn't transform a good scene into a great one. It doesn't make a weak character arc suddenly deeper. A movie still has to work on its own terms. But for a film like Ballerina, presentation is a major part of the equation. In many ways, this connects back to the larger conversation about the movie itself. Ballerina is not a film where every element is equally strong. The screenplay has limitations. The emotional development is sometimes uneven. The mythology expansion occasionally feels more interesting than the personal story. But the technical filmmaking, the action, the atmosphere, and the visual style are all designed to create an experience. And experiences are often affected by how they are consumed. That is why some viewers may come away feeling like they watched exactly what they wanted from a John Wick spin-off. They saw impressive choreography. They saw stylish environments. They saw a new assassin enter a familiar world and deliver a collection of memorable action sequences. Others may walk away focusing on what the film does not quite achieve. They may feel that the character development needed more depth. They may feel that Eve deserved a more distinctive story. They may feel that the movie spends too much time reminding audiences where it belongs rather than fully defining where it wants to go. Both reactions can exist at the same time. Because ultimately, Ballerina is a movie built around a fascinating contradiction. It wants to be its own thing while also making sure audiences recognize exactly what it belongs to. It wants Eve to stand independently while also benefiting from the enormous legacy surrounding John Wick. It wants to expand the universe while preserving the mystery that made the universe interesting in the first place. Sometimes it solves those challenges successfully. Sometimes you can see the struggle. But perhaps that struggle is also what makes the film worth discussing. A completely unsuccessful spin-off would be easy to dismiss. A completely successful one would be easy to celebrate. Ballerina exists in the more interesting middle ground. It shows both the possibilities and the difficulties of expanding a franchise built around an iconic central figure. It proves the world is big enough for new stories. The remaining question is whether those stories can eventually become big enough to create their own legends. It doesn't completely redefine the franchise. It doesn't dramatically change the way audiences view this world. It doesn't reach the same legendary status as the strongest entries in the John Wick series. But perhaps that was never the realistic goal. A spin-off like this does not need to replace what came before. It needs to prove that something else can exist alongside it. And in that sense, Ballerina succeeds. The movie's biggest accomplishment may actually be its willingness to leave the door open. It introduces Eve, gives her a place within this universe, and creates enough curiosity about where her story could go next. That does not mean every creative decision works perfectly. It does not mean the character is fully developed. It does not mean the franchise has completely solved the challenge of expanding beyond John Wick. But it does mean the possibility exists. And that possibility is important. Because successful franchises eventually reach a point where they have to answer a difficult question: is the world itself interesting, or was the audience only interested because of one specific character? The best universes survive because they create multiple characters, multiple conflicts, and multiple perspectives that can carry stories forward. Ballerina suggests that the John Wick universe might have that potential. Whether it reaches that potential depends entirely on what happens next. A future Eve story would need to do more than simply deliver bigger action sequences. The first movie already proves that Ana de Armas can handle the physical demands of the role. The next challenge would be giving her a richer emotional journey, a stronger personal identity, and conflicts that are about more than revenge. The character needs opportunities to exist outside the mission that initially defines her. Because ultimately, that is what separates memorable action heroes from simply effective ones. People remember the fights, but they connect with the person behind them. John Wick became iconic not just because he was dangerous, but because audiences understood his pain, his loss, his impossible choices, and the emotional weight behind every decision he made. Eve has the foundation of an interesting character, but future stories will need to explore the parts of her that exist beyond survival and vengeance. That is the biggest opportunity moving forward. As for Ballerina itself, I think the fairest way to describe it is as a successful expansion rather than a revolutionary one. It delivers what audiences expect from this universe while introducing enough new ideas to justify its existence. It may not be the next evolution of the franchise, but it proves the franchise still has somewhere to go. And maybe that is exactly what a spin-off should accomplish. Not replacing the original. Not overshadowing it. Not pretending the past doesn't matter. Instead, adding another piece to the larger world and convincing audiences that there are still stories worth telling. Ballerina may not be flawless. It may not satisfy everyone. Some viewers will leave wishing it took bigger creative risks. Others will simply appreciate getting another stylish, violent, and carefully crafted entry in one of modern action cinema's most recognizable universes. But after all the debates surrounding its identity, its connection to John Wick, its character development, and its place within the franchise, one thing becomes clear. Ballerina proves that this world still has life left in it. The question is no longer whether the universe can continue without John Wick at the center. The question is whether future stories can become compelling enough that audiences stop asking for him back. Because ultimately, that may be the most important thing Ballerina accomplishes. It does not completely solve the challenge of expanding the John Wick universe, but it proves that the challenge is worth attempting. The door is open. Now the question is what the franchise chooses to do with that opportunity. A future built around Eve could go in several different directions. It could continue focusing on the larger assassin world, exploring new organizations, new rivalries, and new corners of the mythology that have only been briefly introduced. Or it could move in a more personal direction, focusing less on the systems around her and more on the person she is becoming after everything she has experienced. The most interesting version of Eve's story is probably not one where she simply becomes another legendary killer. The franchise already has that character. It has already explored what happens when someone becomes a myth. The more compelling question is what happens when someone is still trying to figure out who they are while carrying the weight of becoming one. That is where future stories could separate Eve from John Wick rather than constantly comparing her to him. Because comparisons will always exist. That is unavoidable. John Wick is one of the defining action characters of modern cinema, and any new protagonist entering this universe will naturally be measured against him. But the goal should not be to create another John Wick. The goal should be to create the first great Eve story. Ballerina gets close to that idea. It establishes the foundation. It introduces the character. It shows what she can do physically. What remains is giving audiences a deeper reason to follow her beyond the next mission. And that brings the conversation back to the future of the franchise as a whole. Expanding a universe is always a balancing act. Fans want more. Studios want to continue successful properties. But the danger is that expansion can eventually make a world feel less special. Mystery can disappear when every corner is explained. New stories can feel unnecessary when they exist only because the brand is valuable. The John Wick universe has always worked because it felt larger than what audiences were seeing. There was always another organization, another rule, another hidden layer waiting to be discovered. Maintaining that sense of discovery will be crucial if the franchise continues growing. Ballerina suggests that there is still potential there. It does not provide all the answers, but it proves that the world can support different perspectives. And maybe that is the most important victory. Not every new chapter has to redefine the entire story. Sometimes it simply has to prove that the story can continue. That is where Ballerina ultimately lands for me. It is not the greatest film in the franchise. It is not the most emotionally powerful. It is not the entry that changes everything we know about this universe. But it is a successful experiment. It takes one of modern action cinema's most recognizable worlds and asks a simple question: can someone else carry this legacy? The answer is not a perfect yes. But it is a convincing enough yes that the question becomes exciting rather than impossible. And for a spin-off, that is a meaningful achievement. Ballerina may not be the future of the John Wick universe by itself. But it proves that the future does not have to end with John Wick. There are still stories to tell. There are still characters worth exploring. And if the franchise learns from the strengths and weaknesses of this film, Eve may have the opportunity to become something more than just the next person to inherit the world of assassins. She could become someone who truly belongs in it. As for the future of the franchise, Ballerina feels like a test run. A proof of concept. An experiment designed to answer one very specific question: can the John Wick universe survive expansion? I don't think the film provides a definitive answer. Not yet. But I do think it provides enough evidence to keep the conversation alive. Because at the end of the day, Ballerina succeeds more often than it fails. Not every story beat lands perfectly. Not every character receives the development they deserve. Not every connection to the larger franchise feels completely necessary. But the movie delivers enough entertainment, enough spectacle, and enough potential to justify why it exists. And sometimes, that is exactly what a spin-off needs to accomplish. It does not need to replace the original. It does not need to become bigger than the franchise that created it. It simply needs to prove that there are still stories worth telling within that world. Ballerina does that. Whether it becomes the beginning of a larger future for Eve or remains a fascinating side chapter in the John Wick saga, the film succeeds at one important thing: it gives audiences a reason to wonder what comes next. And that may be the strongest foundation any franchise expansion can have. Because the future of this universe will not be determined by how many characters it can introduce or how many stories it can produce. It will be determined by whether those stories feel necessary. Ballerina does not completely answer that challenge, but it proves the challenge is worth taking seriously. For a franchise built around survival against impossible odds, that feels like a surprisingly fitting place to end. The world of John Wick has always been about finding a way forward when the odds seem overwhelming. Now, the franchise itself faces a similar challenge. The question is no longer whether John Wick's story can continue. The question is whether this world can create legends of its own.